So let me welcome all of you today to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, both the audience here and our online audience. We apologize for the slight delay. It's a great pleasure to host you. I'm Fred Bergston, the founding director of the Peterson Institute, now director emeritus and a senior fellow here, and standing in for Adam Posen today, our president, who is out of town. Before starting the program today, I want to say a quick tribute to Marty Feldstein. Marty, of course, died earlier this week. He was one of the true giants in the field of economics and a global statesman in this field. He spoke frequently here at the Institute. He ran the National Bureau of Economic Research for 30 years, about the same 30 years that I was running this institute, and we often joked, we frequently tripped over each other going into the offices of foundation presidents seeking funding for our respective institutions. But Marty was a real giant in the field. He was a major policy maker, influencer of policy, worked with Larry in the past, and I just want to say a word of tribute and how much we will miss him and how much we deeply regard him and the wonderful life and career that he led.
You're here.
It's a particular pleasure to welcome Larry Kudlow to our podium today. Larry, I thank you for coming, especially now, as you can tell with the cane, Larry has just been out of action for a couple of weeks to get a hip replacement. And he just got back in the office on Monday, so he's still working his way back into full shape. And so we're particularly appreciative of his joining us today and wish you good recovery and back into full gear immediately.
Thank you, Fred.
I suspect everybody knows Larry. He became, I think, the 12th assistant to the president for economic policy, joining the White House a little over a year ago. He's assistant to the president for economic policy, advises a whole range of issues, director of the National Economic Council, responsible for coordinating all of economic policy, including foreign economic matters. He spent time in the Reagan White House back in the 1980s, was associate director for economics and planning at OMB. He earlier started his career at the New York Fed, spent time in the private sector, chief economist at Bear Stearns, well before it imploded. I think you left well before it imploded.
I imploded before it imploded.
Well, we won't talk about that yet. And of course, Larry's best known for his long and very successful career in the media, running TV and radio programs. I had the pleasure to appear a number of times with Larry. We sometimes sparred, but we agreed on a lot of things too, particularly on free trade, which we'll come back to later. But Larry was a very successful and active participant in that realm for many years. Now, the order of the day is very simple. I'm going to ask Larry a few leading questions and try to probe him on some aspects of U.S. economic policy, both domestic and international. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and run until about 1:30. Larry has to get back for a meeting in the Oval Office at 2, but we'll run until that time. So Larry, let's start with the domestic economy. The economy is obviously very strong. It's doing extremely well in the aggregate. What's your outlook for the next year or so, from now to the election and beyond for the medium to longer run? You've suggested growth at about 3% annually, but the majority of forecasters is not so optimistic.
Right.
This Congressional Budget Office, all of the blue chip forecasters, OECD, are all expecting something like 2% or less. So there's quite a gulf. In fact, I don't think any of the blue chip forecasters are up to your 3% level, which is a bit of an unprecedented outlier position for the administration. So tell us how to reconcile that. Tell us why you're so optimistic and why you think your more optimistic view will prevail.
They're wrong. good people, professionals, many of whom are friends of mine. But it's sort of like optimism is a lost art, and I remain in the optimistic camp. I base the short run and the longer term outlook on the policies of the administration, which I helped develop several years ago during the campaign, and now are working on them the last year and a half or so. I think what we've got here is an incentive model of economic growth through lower tax rates, particularly the business tax rates, and very significant rollback of regulations across the board, and opening up of the energy sector, which is throwing off unbelievable supplies of oil and gas, among other things, and the trade reforms, which probably, maybe they're the most controversial part of this. I don't know. We can talk about that. This is a very distinguished group on that subject. But market openings, I think, will be greatly to our benefit. And I just want to add one little point. We were talking at lunch for a moment. I'm very keen on the economic growth impact or potential impact of the USMCA trade deal, which has been agreed upon by Mexico, Canada, of course, the US government. We're waiting to see if it can get through Congress. And Speaker Pelosi has been very accommodative thus far, and I'm optimistic about that. Bob Lighthizer is leading the charge, of course, for our team. But I just want to note that, and I'm sure we will have a lively talk about the China trade, but in economic terms, more directly, USMCA has more powerful impact. And based on the numbers from the International Trade Commission, the ITC, and then Kevin Hassett and I buffed him a little bit at CEA and NEC, you know, we could be looking, when it has fully impacted the economy, we could be looking at a 0.5% additional GDP, real GDP, over time, over the longer run, with attendant increases in direct investment and a real booster rocket to, I think, a lot of jobs in the new economy as well as the old. You've got a combination there of old economy improvements and new economy opportunities, and I think there'll be a pretty good pickup in jobs also. Of course, these kinds of estimates have ranges and so forth, but I'm just saying that I don't see any, I'm pushing this out there. I mean, I was half dead at the beginning of the week when I came to work, but they put me in front of some media people. I just don't see, I want you all to talk about that, okay? You may like it or not like it. I just want you to talk about it and stop obsessing about China. So I just thought I'd sneak that in. Elsewhere, look, I think the performance of the economy has been pretty good the last couple of years. Some people agree with our supply side views, lower tax rates, greater incentives. Some don't. I appreciate that, and I respect those disagreements, as always. But I think the policies have been working. Nothing is obviously steady every month or every quarter, but I think, you know, over the last couple of years, we've had a nice move up in growth. I think it is sustainable. We've also had a nice move down in inflation, which I also think is sustainable. And I think a lot of people forget, and it's, you know, you're talking about Marty Feldstein, who was a great man. You know, we're supply side policies, you know, and I get that not everyone agrees, but from my point of view, or our point of view, the president's point of view, you know, we're creating incentives to produce and invest and pick up the supply side or the business side or the production side of the economy, which has not done very well for the last 10 years. And you know, it doesn't matter which political party was running the place. It's not been a good period. And along with that, things like productivity and real wages. And I would argue that that is counterinflationary and that You can have your cake and eat it too, with strong growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. I think the Federal Reserve is starting to come around to that point of view, which is good. And I don't see why it can't continue. That's all. I just don't see why. A couple years ago, my latest book was about John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan and their successful use of lower marginal tax rates and incentives. It worked in those days. I think it's working now. I think it worked, not only for Reagan, but there were some disagreements with former President Bill Clinton, but I think when I see him in New York, I always told him he was Reagan's third term, depending on his mood. Sometimes he liked that, sometimes he didn't. But I think these policies have worked in the past, and I think they're going to work again. And if we can get trade barriers down and a more reciprocal trading system and a return to some trading rules, AKA the China battle, all the better. All the better. It'll open up markets. But I think the USA, we're hot. We're the place to invest. Direct foreign investment is flowing in very nicely. And there's a few things here and there maybe we'll talk about, but I think the picture is a good picture.
Larry, let me maybe push that a little farther. You have stressed confidence as a key factor in the economic outlook. And one question that's been raised about the outlook and confidence in it is the trade side. As you know, there have been a couple of studies recently that suggest that if the tariffs that the president has proposed with China, now fortunately not with Mexico, but if those things had gone ahead, they might have amounted to a tax increase that would have offset your tax cut of a year ago and actually dampened the economic outlook and dampened confidence. So how do you make sure that your trade policy does support the outlook you're suggesting, reinforces confidence, promotes the investment boom that you keep looking for, rather than cutting in the other direction?
You know, it's an interesting and somewhat complicated question. I mean, at one level, confidence or not. Confidence, I would just say confidence surveys are very good right now, very good. Including business confidence surveys, maybe not quite as high as they were a month or two ago, but very good. Even among those, sort of our critics like the BRT, they're coming in tomorrow to present their forecast to the president and our team, but even their numbers are still pretty darn good. I think they're 2.6 or 2.7 growth, and their confidence is good. Consumer confidence is terrific, NFIB confidence is terrific. So, I like that part, I like what I see. Look, I would just say this, on the issue of, I guess you're saying tariffs versus taxes on a flow basis. I just don't see the world that way, Fred, and I may be wrong from an academic point of view, but look, lowering marginal tax rates creates incentive rewards. And I never like to measure tax cuts or tax hikes on the basis of just the cash flow. Right? I like to look at it, is there an incentive effect or an anti-incentive effect? And that tells me whether you're going to get the future investment and work effort or not. Now, on the flow numbers, I saw a good article by my friend Jim Tankersley in the New York Times, sizing that up, and other people have done this, the Tax Foundation. It's kind of complicated, though, isn't it? I mean, look, the incidence of taxation does create a revenue increase, a tax, quote unquote, tax increase, just by the mechanical nature of a tariff, right? The custom duty goes up, and we buy a good commodity, and we have to pay more because of the tariff. Okay, and we are running ahead a wee bit. I think we're $15 billion ahead of last year on custom duty tariff revenues right now. It's a fairly small amount. It will grow over time depending on the policies, but the economic burden or the economics of it are different, much more favorable. And this is the part that I think a lot of people have missed, and I don't want to bore you and try and walk through every darn thing there is, but just in simple terms, we will have a choice of where to buy goods and services, particularly the goods. So we don't have to buy from China and hence pay the tariff. We don't have to. There are other countries, including Mexico, that are substitutes. So the elasticities can be pretty strong. And I think that plays into it. So any consumer effects, I'll just call the economics consumer effects, I think will be very, very small, Fred, very small. I mean, we've looked at this, Kevin and I, minuscule. And the overall economic picture, the so-called economic burden, is, I think, actually going to shift to China more than it's going to damage the U.S. Now, that remains to be seen, and people will say, well, we don't know this, and some models disagree. I appreciate that, but I would just put that perspective in. The economic burden is different than the actual customs duty that are being used.
But Larry, what about when you add in the retaliation against our exports? So we take some hit, at least, on the import side as well. Higher costs. You buy from somewhere else, but they're not as efficient. So, you're going to pay higher prices, reduce our own competitiveness, hurts our exports, but also we get retaliation. So I think when you look at the policies taken together, they've actually hurt our exports and therefore undermined that very important sector of the economy. In addition, I mean, you're right, certainly. You have to think about tax cuts in terms of structural and systemic effects as well. But the same thing on trade, because if the trade approach raises questions in people's minds about the openness of the global trading system, something you've always strongly supported, but if you open questions about that, then trade flows tend to shrink, shrivel up, unravel around the world. So you get a kind of negative psychology that you're going to have to set against your positive psychology. So again, I heard you earlier when you said you want to get toward reducing barriers, free trade, but how do you get from here to there, where here seems to be going down the other track?
You know how you get from here to there, Fred? You kick some butt. You kick some butt, in my best economic, analytical, quantitative regression analysis approach. Now, I'm not trying to be cheeky, and I have great, great, great respect for you and this group. That's why I'm here. But let me just tell you, we didn't start this, but what I will call the China problem has been going on for a long time, several decades. But President Trump is the first guy in these several decades to take strong actions to remedy a very unbalanced trading relationship where the Chinese have violated international trade law, WTO law, have embarked more and more. You know this, I'm just going to knock out the basic factoids here, whether it's IP theft or forced transfer of technology or ownership restrictions or tariff and non-tariff barriers on commodities and goods or cyber interference. They've been doing this for years, and it's getting worse. So that is impairing us. Now, I think if you had a level playing field, and this is the president's view, we would have a massive surge of American exports to China. Massive, because we are much more efficient than they are, much more efficient, whether technology advancement or now, you see indicators in the U.S. coming back like rising productivity, which I have my fingers crossed. I know it's just 4, 5, 6 quarters, but I have my fingers crossed that what we hoped would happen might be happening. We're very efficient. And money is flocking to the U.S., and direct investment here is very good. So I'm just saying, if China gives us an opening and a level playing field and quits breaking the law, we will do great. Now, last point. As I said, I think in the near term, whatever the president decides to do on imminent tariff decisions, he's meeting with Xi. Well, that's not a formalized meeting yet, but the intent is to meet with Xi at the G20 in Tokyo, in Japan. Whatever he decides to do, I think, again, the consumer impact, quote unquote, will be very, very small, and the overall economic burden will hurt China more than it hurts us. That's the way we're looking at it. But even if, let me make this additional point. We can quibble about that, we can disagree with that, but I want to say from our standpoint, to protect America's economy and its, farmers, ranchers, auto workers, manufacturing workers, and so forth, as well as our technology patents and so forth. To do that on a cost-benefit basis, it's worth it. It's worth it. We can't let the status quo continue the way it has continued because the president has said, and look, you campaigned on this and he's going to continue, it has hurt us. The status quo has hurt us. So I understand here in Washington and elsewhere in Wall Street, and I'm a free trade guy, but the walls have to come down. The behavior has to change. The world's trading system is broken, and President Trump is the guy that's trying to fix it. And it's not easy, but he believes it will help, America's long run. I happen to agree with him. As a free trader, I agree. And I note that some of my free trade pals are starting to have the same point of view. It's not clean, all right? It's a jolt. I get that, so sometimes we have to jolt.
Larry, I think there's widespread.
That's a point of view.
I think there's widespread agreement, including in this room, I suspect, with the goals.
You agree with this?
Yeah.
We talked the other day.
No, absolutely. No, China has been cheating. The rules need to be improved. The rules need to be adhered to. It is not, the past approach has not been effective to get that. I think most people agree with that. The question is, you're kicking butt. Will that achieve the outcome? You've been very much involved in these talks. You've been involved, I know, in trying to strengthen working with our allies.
Yes.
Vis-a-vis China, which I think has been a shortcoming in the strategy. You haven't had enough coalition with the allies to kind of bring a monolateral approach to bear on China, because the Chinese don't like to be isolated.
But I want them to be.
Well, so, bring the alliances together, which you've worked on, I know, particularly with Europe. Talk a little about that, but also your prognosis. Do you think the butt-kicking approach will work? China's a big player, a rising power. Will we be able to coerce them into the kind of cooperation we want? Or is some alternative approach, maybe more with the allies, at least an adjunct to that?
Well, you put it well. Look, I would probably, Fred, substitute the word persuade for the word coerce.
You said kick butt, but that's okay.
Yeah, I really did. That's the spirit of the thing. It's funny, I'm not a trade expert, I'm not a China expert. From almost the minute I got here, I've been involved in this thing. Thank you to your points on the other allies, because that's important. I mentioned earlier the USMCA deal, okay? Which is very important to us, gigantic trading partners and allies. Canada and Mexico, and we may quarrel sometimes, family, but basically we're on the same page. That's very important. That's very important. Last autumn at the UN meetings, we participated in the drafting and signing of something called the Trilateral something or other, which is basically EU, USA, and Japan. It was a 2 or 3 page statement against non-market trading practices, I'll call it. Everybody knows, designed as a shot across the bow to China. And subsequently, I might add, Chinese ambassadors, French and German ambassadors in China made very strong speeches, same with Japan, and we appreciate the help. President Trump would go it alone if he had to, but we are engaged in these dialogues with our allies in Europe and Japan, and that's very important. we also will be engaged. You know, we may come out with free trade deals of one kind or another with these guys, and I think that would be good too. I mean, we're doing a lot of trade negotiating right now around the world. The idea that we're somehow isolated or not engaged in the world scene is just not true. I mean, Bob Lighthizer, who's another old Reagan guy, we first met way years ago, he's got his hands full. I think he's about the best in the business, but he's just got a lot of balls in the air. So we're doing that stuff. We're talking, and they're coming our way. They're coming our way. And we're not going to leave this. That's the important thing. I think, you know, Fred, when I think about this, what do I want to say here? It's very hard to change past practices in Washington. It just, you know, from a policy standpoint. It's probably true in Wall Street too. But what I'm trying to get across is the president comes in a couple years ago making no secret of the fact that he wants to change the establishment. Drain the swamp was the political rallying cry, which frankly includes trade. And swamp draining or egg breaking, or I don't want to get into too much metaphorical trouble here, is not necessarily cheered, because the ancien regime likes to defend what it has. I don't want to name any names, but they're not the Chamber of Commerce, people like that. I consider them the ancien regime. You know, ankle biting and working their mouths too rapidly. That you either want change or you don't. And so, okay, I get it. There is a certain amount of coercion here. President Trump's a hell of a negotiator. He's a risk taker. I think so far it's paid off, but we'll see. He's the decision maker, so I'm not going to make any forecasts. I'm just saying we're breaking omelets. We're draining the international, global trading rules swamp. I saw this, if I can just depart for 1 second. About a year ago, when I was with the president at the G7 in outside Quebec, we fought like hell over the communique. You know, and POTUS just kind of put little Larry right in the middle. He says, "This is no good. You need to fix this," and I did. Now I knew some of the other leaders, or they knew me, but we did what we had to do right there, all Friday night, and then Saturday morning. I'll never forget it. And it was a lot about reforming the WTO and returning to a rules-based global trading system or international trading system, which we do not have. We didn't invent this. We inherited this. So we're trying to make some sense of it, and obviously we want to do it in a manner that really, it will really be good for the U.S. economy and all of our aspects, as I say, farmers, ranchers, auto workers, and everybody, new tech, new economy, old economy. And we want to work with our allies, but if we have to go it alone, we will. But this thing has to be changed. It just has to be changed, okay? I mean, and it's hard. Change like this is really hard because we've become too comfortable with the existing system, which is not helping the United States. I think on the whole, it's hurt the United States. So anyway, as a supply sider, I like the fact that we are growing domestically, you know, strong growth, low unemployment, low inflation. We have a steady currency. Talk about confidence, people investing here from all over the world. You know, so our bond rates are so low because of that in many respects. We're like the safe haven. And a new incentive system, a refreshing incentive. And I'll just say this, I'm willing to take this battle. Look, I'm a free market guy, I make no bones about it. The last 40 years, you know me. I will say regarding China, institutionally, as a nation, they are on the wrong side of history, Fred. The collectivist big government model, which is returning to fashion in China. They are moving wrong direction. And, you know, the old market-based reforms of Deng Xiaoping are in many ways a thing of the past. And you look at the newspapers every day now, the riots in Hong Kong, as an example of additional political repression. You ask yourself, can a government doing that actually open up, liberalize its economy through better trading? I don't know. But I'm just saying they are on the wrong side of history. We will win this battle. People say they take the long view. I'm taking the long view. It's like when I was a kid working for Reagan, and Reagan was the only guy in town saying he's going to overthrow, not contain, overthrow the Soviet Union. Okay? Well, it's different now. I'm not making a completely similar case, but I would say to you, collectivism and statism and government controlism doesn't work. It doesn't deliver the goods, and it doesn't deliver the freedoms, and I'm willing to make that bet. I think we are on the right side of history. I apologize for the editorial.
No, Larry, that's very profound, and thank you for it. And I think you get a lot of support here for your effort to find multilateral ways to reform, improve the trading system, move it in the market direction. And our own Nick Lardy's written a recent book that supports what you were saying about China's economic policy moving in the wrong direction. So a lot of support. Before I open up to the audience, and probably come back to trade, I want to just go to two other macroeconomic issues. Monetary policy. The president has on occasion expressed some questions, shall we say, about the value of the independence of the Federal Reserve. Well, that's what it sounded like. That's why I want to ask you about it. Because, just to put it bluntly, do you doubt that Fed independence is really important?
I don't doubt it.
And
put that right, I don't doubt it.
So how should the administration interact with the Fed?
A little known fact, I've known Fred so long, and if you totaled it up down through the years, I'd say we're a split. We've both been right and we've both been wrong. That's why I love to listen to. We used to argue a lot on the old McLaughlin group. Remember those days? That really goes back.
That's right.
So maybe we'll go back into that mode, which I love. So look, no. President's view is not to undermine central bank independence. And certainly not my view. President's view, however, disagrees with Fed policy. And as I've said, he said, I've said, but he has a lot of knowledge. He was a businessman, successful businessman, successful investor. He has opinions about almost everything, including interest rates and the Fed. And he's not shy about expressing. That doesn't mean we're climbing the ramparts, but it just means he has a different point of view. I think he has, a right to say it. And he's made no secret of it. And by the way, for what it's worth, I have backed him. Without gosh, it's so hard to have this, without for a moment undermining Fed independence, but my opinion, actually, 3 months ago, I said they're 50 basis points too tight on their target rate. They went too far in the fourth quarter. The bond market has been certainly messaging that now on a very steady basis for many weeks. And, the yield curve is inverted and the futures market is showing lower, not higher rates. We'll see how that turns out. The Fed will act on its own time. I'm not trying to jawbone, but I don't know. Presidents have, down through the years, expressed opinions about monetary policy. I worked for a president who was knowledgeable and quite a strong communicator. And if he has a point of view, he puts it out there. I don't know. I think that's kind of cool myself. We'll see how it turns out. Far be it for me to suggest that it would be great if the FOMC cut their target rate in the June meeting.
You wouldn't do such a thing. Final question from me before we open it up. Fiscal policy. One of Marty Feldstein's last columns in the Journal back in March said, it was entitled, "The Debt Crisis is Coming Soon."
Yeah.
The lead line said, "The most dangerous domestic problem facing America's federal government is the rapid growth of its budget deficit and national debt." Deficit's going to hit $1 trillion soon. Projections, as you well know, have it going up pretty much inexorably, despite the fact the economy, as you say rightly, is now strong, close to full employment, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that? Does it pose a problem? Could fiscal policy respond when we get into the inevitable turn down or next recession? Longer run prospect? How do you think about the debt and the deficits?
Well, Marty was, that was a good column. I actually spoke to him after he wrote that column. I wanted to add, the Marty thing hangs over us. He wrote a wonderful note to me, email, encouraging me when my name surfaced for this job, encouraging me to go ahead. I really appreciated that from him, coming from him. So, Fred, on the issue of the fiscal imbalance, again, I'll repeat long-held views of mine, which the president shares. We're not going to move towards a more balanced position unless we grow the economy. It's just essential. You can limit government, limit spending, reform programs, and so forth. I'm not going to go into any details here, but let's say 1 percentage point faster growth above the CBO baseline over 10 years lowers the budget deficit by, $3 trillion or so. That's their rule of thumb. And I basically agree with that. That's a lot of money. So, let's start with growth. And I think, we, in our estimates and our discussions, I still believe if we get the growth baseline that we're suggesting, let's just say 3% for argument's sake, the revenues will fill in pretty rapidly. I think there's some evidence that the corporate tax cut has already paid for itself. There are different analytics about these things. I wouldn't say the overall tax cut has paid for itself. I wouldn't go that far, but I think the business side probably has paid for itself. Be that as it may, the bill was passed in late 17, so we're now in the middle of 19. And I need a little time here. I just need another couple of years, and I said this at the time, to let the revenues fill in if we get the kind of growth that we are hoping for. So that's point number one. Point number two, I don't think we're at a crisis point now. I agree with your figures. I think people may be surprised if the numbers are going to turn out a little better. But let's put that aside for a minute. It's a matter of opinion. So publicly held debt is $16, $17 trillion or so. And GDP is not quite $20 trillion. So you could call it 90%, reasonable estimate. That by itself is not a catastrophe. It doesn't bother me right now. It's the longer term trend that bothers me. If we had mediocre growth, we keep inventing new entitlements, that would bother me. Because then those numbers would ineluctably rise and we'd be losing our revenue base. My hope is that it's the reverse, that we will limit government. The president is tougher and tougher on that. But these ratios, the burden of debt and deficits on the economy will ease because of some restraint in the numerator and some expansion in the denominator. That's always been my view. And Marty was right to point it out, but I don't think we're in a crisis mode right now. I mean, a crisis mode, I'm not even sure I know what that means. I mean, deficits to GDP, I've argued this for God knows how many decades. The lowest deficits to GDP ratios we had were the 1970s, which was arguably the worst economic decade, arguably created by Republican presidents. We're higher now. I mean, it was 25% in those days. What do we get out of that? Not much. So I think that's pretty iffy stuff.
So what happens when and if, but it's inevitable, we get into the next downturn? Hopefully it's not on your watch in the next year or so, but when we do, given the level of the debt and deficits, will the political economy permit the kind of fiscal response that I think we would all agree probably would be needed at that point?
Well, that's a hard question. That's a political question. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I know what my point of view will be. I know what President Trump's point of view will be. But I don't know who's going to be controlling Congress.
Which is, I presume, a new fiscal stimulus.
Well, yeah, we would, in those circumstances, we would look for ways, let me phrase it somewhat differently, we would look for ways for pro-growth tax reform, opportunities for more pro-growth tax reform. You know, and I think, I really like what we did on the business side. We could improve it on the individual side. And there's a whole variety of areas which you know well from your Treasury days, you know, using the tax code for social spending purposes. There's a lot of reforms that could be made. Obviously, entitlements would come into that. But yeah, we would probably look for additional pro-growth measures. Root canal is not going to do it. And, but the whole thing, I don't know, the whole deficit thing is so contingent on the health of the economy, or the lack thereof. I mean, that's where I come out on that. I always have it, probably always will. My pal Laffer is going to come down next week and get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And he has been a huge influence on my thinking. And I know some people agree and some people may not agree with his views, but you know, I'm a Laffer curve guy.
Okay, let's open it up. We've got a few minutes left.
I got time. I'll stay.
Okay, you'll
actually,
stay.
We're not doing
We've got a standing mic. We've got a traveling mic. Please identify yourself and then fire away. So let me see right down here first, I think.
Good afternoon, Del Renegar with General Electric. We're of course proud to have you as a GE NBC alum. I wanted to follow up on your comments about China and the importance of competing with them and market access. One thing that the president has done recently is come out strongly in favor of the Exim Bank, which I think a lot of us see as central to competing with China. And the president's talked about weaponizing it.
Actually, that was my line.
That was your line. Okay, well, I believe in proper attribution. But as we're weaponizing Exim Bank, you know, there's a reauthorization process going on, and you know, one of our concerns is there's a lot of efforts, including I think some factions in the White House, working with the House to severely restrict the flexibility of Exim, so we may not achieve the mission. But anyway, I'd love your reaction to talk more about Exim Bank. You know, concentration limits, you know, loss of life, lots of things going on. But anyway, if you would talk about Exim Bank, that would be super helpful.
We stand behind the Exim Bank. I gave the speech myself, and I will give credit where credit is due. Part of my thinking was from a dusty old op-ed piece written by my Reagan friend, John Bolton. I guess they put me out there as punishment for my sins down through the years. And, you know, I don't want to talk about lobbying. I don't want to talk about all this. We are behind the Exim Bank, period. Full stop.
I can testify Larry's telling the truth because I was on the program at the same conference.
Oh, that's right. You were there.
And
that's right.
he gave the keynote and gave a ringing endorsement. And I must say it was very well received.
And it was done, I just want to say, more important than the little nicks and knacks you're referring to, sir, is that the position of our administration, whether you agree or disagree, is at this point in time, we feel we need it for the, shall we say, the trade discussions with China and others. We feel it's an important aspect of national security policy.
Joanne.
Hi, my name is Jo Marie Griesgraber. I'm with New Rules for Global Finance, a nonprofit organization. And I wanted to ask about plans or strategies you all have to reduce the inequality, especially of the bottom, say, 60% of the working population in the United States.
What was it?
The inequality skewed against the lower 60% of the population.
What are you going to do about inequality?
Yeah, well, ma'am, right now, to be honest with you, our focus is on growth and prosperity and jobs. And I can report to you that as a result of these newer policies, the incentive-minded policies to which I referred earlier, the best performing parts of the economy have actually been the lower half, not the upper half. We've had very, very significant gains in blue-collar workers, blue-collar manufacturing, et cetera. You can go through the various BLS definitions. The biggest increases in wages, not the highest wages, but the biggest wage gains have actually come from the bottom half, actually from the bottom 10% or 15%. This is stuff I haven't seen since the Reagan 80s. So the growth policies are succeeding to a large extent. And what we hoped would happen is happening. People are coming back into the labor force for a variety of reasons, sort of out of the woodwork. And they're folks that haven't been working in many cases for a long time, and they are responding to the improvement in the economy and labor conditions. And they're very much in the lower quintiles of the distribution. But our primary goal was to reignite economic growth. And I think that brings a lot of equality.
Next.
Hi there, Dave Lawler from Axios. I'm wondering, do you feel that you ultimately need a deal with China to make a success of this approach? Is that what it's all driving towards? Or is your view that this is a good approach for the United States, even absent an eventual deal? And related to that, you talked a lot about changing Chinese behavior. Is that purely on an economic front, or do you view issues like military buildup, human rights as in the same conversation, or are they two entirely separate conversations? Thank you.
Well, on the second point, I'm focusing on trade and the economy. The other points, the security points and the human rights points you make, which are very important, extremely important, is not my lane per se. Of course, it's part of the broader conversation. I'm not sure I understood your first point. Could you just run that by me again?
So the question is, if we settle in for a long trade war here, President Trump leaves office, there's no grand bargain with China. Is this still the right approach for the United States, or do you view this purely as leverage towards a deal with China?
Again, not sure where you're going, but I prefer to look at it as a tough negotiation, number one. And number two, my hope is that policymakers continue to press the case that President Trump is making. We have to work for big changes in the Chinese trading relationship with the United States. So I hope that continues. And look, let me be honest with you here. Again, as a free trader, President Trump has, I think, I know he's taught me and other members of our team, but friends of mine too, who are quite hostile to his aggressive use of tariffs, have come around in the sense that, look, it's a tool. It's a tool. It's a negotiating tool, but it's not a bluff. As you've seen, he will actually execute or implement tariffs. And as Fred and I have been talking, it's a complicated subject, the economic consequences of that, short-term, medium-term, long-term, but I think the president's spot on. And I hope a lot of people have learned a lot of things about that.
Let me just amend that question away, because I think it is, as you said, it's a profound and very important long-term question. I mean, China is a rising superpower. There's no doubt about that. On some metrics, they already are equal over the longer run. It's a big country. We're going to have to live with them.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to have to find some ways to share the global economic leadership that we've enjoyed for a century.
Okay.
I mean, we have enjoyed global economic leadership pretty much untrammeled for a century for a variety of reasons, but one of which was we never really had any competition. There was no other economy that was anywhere near our capacity. Now we've got one.
Mm.
And so as we look forward, we're going to have to find ways to live with that situation. Now, I totally agree with you. As I said before, I think most people here would agree. China's going to have to make some very important changes in its policies. But at the same time, we're going to have to find a way to reconcile our own traditions, maybe even some of our values, with that rising superpower. How do we do that? How do you walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak? Both move to the level playing field, deal with the immediate problems, but do it in a way that helps pave the way toward a constructive resolution of what I regard as the really long-run fundamental problem that we face in the world economy.
Well, you know, good points and good context. Look, I'm not in a place, I don't think the president is. I don't want to compromise our values right now, ever. Let me say that. As I said earlier, I believe that history is on our side, not their side, by which I mean economic systems of economic freedom. It's a systemic issue.
Yeah.
It's a systemic issue.
Right.
And it does go to Axios chap's point. You know, it includes security and includes human rights and freedom and religious freedom. Yes, all those things are tied in. Important. There's plenty of room for people who abide by the law. There's, you know, we believe strongly in the rule of law in the United States. It's one of the greatest attributes of our whole country's history. And it served us very well and made us different and more successful, which I would argue is really one of the key points about the last 100 years. But we can't let countries trample on our values, our rights, the rule of law. I mean, one of the sticking points here, when you look at the, and this has been made public, but when the cables came in a month ago showing their pullback in what we thought was an agreement, and since then, Fred, the word unbalance appears in Chinese rhetoric a lot. Unbalanced. So they are arguing for a more balanced agreement, and I'm not going to walk through a myriad of details which are already public. But I remember talking to Bob Lighthizer about this. I think I was going on the air or something before my hip operation, and that stuck out in my mind. And the wisdom here is we can't have a so-called balanced agreement because we have such an unbalanced relationship. I mean, we are asking for correctives and remedies for the existing imbalances, which I outlined before on the IP and technology and ownership and all the other things, the laundry list of so-called structural issues. How do you do that? You know, there's a lot of wrongs that need to be righted from the standpoint of international trading rules. And the WTO, a weak sister lately, but it could serve once again a more useful purpose. I'm not going to get into that now. So that something we can't accept that stuff. We shouldn't accept that stuff. The trouble I see here, and this is the point the president wants to make. Look, leaders of both political parties in the States have accepted this for too long. And, you know, sometimes you got to get up there and, as I say, kick some butt to make change. Change is hard. I don't want to repeat myself.
Next question.
Hi, Bob Davis with the Wall Street Journal.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. So we're 2 weeks away from the G20 meeting. As you said, there's not even a formalized meeting between the two leaders. Seems to me that this particular G20 is extraordinarily important because it's the last scheduled time until the fall when the two leaders will get together and will be right on top of the election. So the question, two related questions. One, where are we in terms of the meeting or the significance of the G20? What can you expect from it? And secondly, is China asking as a precondition some sort of resolution on Huawei? And if so, what would be the administration response?
Bob, they're great questions. I can't help you right now. I don't have enough information, and what I have, I'm not going to put out.
Okay.
The very basic point here is President Trump has indicated his strong desire for a meeting, but the meeting is not yet arranged formally. So I would just start from that and wait to see how that plays out. Then from that, we can deal with other scenarios.
Is there a possibility there won't be a meeting?
I don't want to even comment on it. I'm just saying my president has indicated a strong desire to sit and meet. He's also indicated that if the meeting doesn't come to pass, there may be consequences. But he would prefer the meeting. So we're waiting to hear from the Chinese.
Next question.
Hi, this is Zhang Qi with Caixin Media, the private business news organization in China. My question is specifically on Huawei. It seems like China doesn't China want to separate Huawei from trade negotiations, but the president has suggested a couple of times that it could be part of the deal. So I'm wondering, is the administration actually wants to include Huawei in the negotiations to have more leverage? And secondly, if there could be a Huawei deal, what could it look like? Is it going to be something like ZTE did last year, like a big fine and a change of senior executives and also a export control monitor from US side to have great access to the company? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to say much on that. The president himself indicated a week or two ago that Huawei was both a security issue and a trade issue. He was quite clear about that. In terms of remedies and whatnot, you know, we have an executive order with respect to Huawei's role and U.S. government spending practices. We also have a new entities proclamation, and there's a 3-month period of licensing. In other words, I have nothing new to add to that discussion.
Next question.
I'm Kevin Cirilli, Chief Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg Television and Radio. Thank you to the Peterson Institute as well as to Larry Kudlow for doing this. I wanted to follow up on a point that you had made earlier about big government and China. What do you say? Many have said that China is playing the long game, as you have alluded to with these trade talks. But do the Hong Kong protests illustrate a counter to that argument? And what should the expectations be to market watchers and observers as we inch closer to this potential meeting in the short term with President Trump and President Xi?
Well, what did you mean by the counter? I'm interested in that line of thinking. I hadn't heard that. What are you referring
Just that
to?
the protests would argue that there is a somewhat of a perhaps unrest or uncertainty about the big government nature, authoritarian nature of the Chinese.
Well, look, they're having a hell of a fight over that. And without elaborating too much, what does that tell you? Now, the Hong Kong citizens, I won't say all of them, but a lot of them, a couple of 100,000 worth, risking life and limb, are marching in protest of these new laws. Is it Tiananmen Square? Not exactly. Does it make one think of Tiananmen Square? How many years ago was that? 30 years ago?
30th
Yeah.
anniversary.
It makes one think of Tiananmen Square and the battle over freedom. And I'm just asking a simple question here regarding the values, norms, structures, rules of the Chinese government hierarchy. Do they want the kind of liberalization that we are pressing for on the trade front? And when you see what's going on in Hong Kong, you kind of raise your eyebrows. I think you are. That's all.
And just a quick, to switch gears on USMCA, are you confident that the votes are there right now from the Democratic perspective in the House of Representatives? And do you think we might get a vote ahead of the August recess? Thank you.
Well, okay. I really should let Bob Lighthizer. We just had a meeting about that with the president. I can mention that because ABC TV was doing it, filming it, George Stephanopoulos. But I think if and when the speaker gives us a vote, yeah, I think it's going to pass. I wouldn't dare predict timing. And as I said earlier, I think the speaker has been very accommodative to us, given us a fair hearing on it. So let's be hopeful. But my biggest point was, to Fred's point or some of the others, USMCA, I hate to be redundant on it, USMCA is a hugely positive economic growth factor. And it's not, you're not giving it its place in the world. And we're proud of the deal. We can negotiate good free trade deals.
Larry, on that note, I think maybe being respectful of your time and knowing you need to get back to the White House, I want to thank you very much for coming to us today, particularly given your recovery mode. We wish you the best of further recovery. Hope you feel well. Hope you get back to full strength. Hope you fight the good fight. And we'll look forward to continuing the discussion and wishing you success in all your objectives.
Last night on this show, we showed this picture